How does a democracy, a system built on freedom and individual rights, collapse? It's a question that echoes through history, but it's not always about an external invasion or a violent overthrow. Sometimes, the most profound threats emerge from within, nurtured by fear, anger, and a promise of salvation. This is the story of how one of the world's most advanced nations willingly surrendered its freedoms, step by step, to a single man and a single idea. It's a historical account of how a political system, under immense pressure, was dismantled not with a single blow, but through a slow, methodical corrosion of its very foundations. This isn't just a story about the past. It's a cautionary tale about the fragility of democracy itself and the eternal vigilance required to protect it. To understand this catastrophic failure, we must first go back to Germany in the aftermath of World War I. The year is 1919. The German Empire has been defeated, and the nation is reeling. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June, imposed devastating terms. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war, cede vast territories, and pay crippling reparations to the Allied powers. This wasn't just a political document, it was a national humiliation. The German people, who had been told they were winning the war, felt betrayed not by their enemies, but by their own leaders. This gave rise to the stab-in-the-back myth, a poisonous lie that claimed the army was undefeated but had been betrayed by politicians and civilians on the home front. The new government, the Weimar Republic, was born into this climate of anger and resentment. It was a bold experiment in democracy, with a progressive constitution that guaranteed universal suffrage and civil liberties. But from its first day, it was seen by many as illegitimate a government imposed by the victors. The economic situation was equally dire. To pay the war reparations, the government resorted to printing massive amounts of money. This led to hyperinflation. By 1923, the German currency, the mark, was virtually worthless. People's life savings were wiped out overnight. A loaf of bread that cost a few marks in the morning could cost millions by the evening. Imagine pushing a wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy groceries, only to find the price had doubled by the time you reached the store. This economic chaos shattered the middle class and created widespread despair. Just as Germany began to stabilize in the mid-1920s, another disaster struck, the Great Depression of 1929. The American stock market crash triggered a global economic collapse, and Germany, heavily reliant on American loans, was hit harder than almost any other nation. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment skyrocketed. By 1932, over 6 million Germans, nearly a third of the workforce, were jobless. People were hungry, desperate, and losing faith in the democratic system that seemed incapable of solving their problems. The streets of Berlin and other cities were filled with political turmoil, with violent clashes between communists and far-right nationalists becoming a daily occurrence. The Weimar government, a coalition of moderate parties, was paralyzed by infighting and unable to form a stable majority. This was the fertile ground upon which extremism could grow. People weren't just looking for a politician. They were desperate for a savior, someone who would restore order, national pride, and economic security, no matter the cost. Into this vortex of chaos stepped Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazis. Initially a minor fringe group, they skillfully exploited the public's fear and anger. Hitler was a master of propaganda, a charismatic speaker who understood the psychology of a crowd. He didn't engage in complex policy debates. Instead, he offered simple answers to complex problems. He told Germans they were not to blame for their suffering. The blame, he insisted, lay with scapegoats. The Treaty of Versailles, the politicians of the Weimar Republic, communists, and, most venomously, Jewish people whom he falsely portrayed as a corrupting force in German society. His speeches were not lectures. They were theatrical performances, held in massive, torchlit rallies. They were designed to bypass reason and appeal directly to emotion. Joseph Goebbels, his propaganda minister, orchestrated this campaign with ruthless efficiency. They used every available medium: posters, radio, films, and newspapers to hammer home their message of national rebirth and racial purity. The swastika became a ubiquitous symbol of power and promise. They presented Hitler not just as a leader, but as a messianic figure destined to lead Germany back to greatness. Simultaneously, the Nazis used intimidation to silence their opponents. Their paramilitary wing, the SAO Brownshirts, roamed the streets, breaking up the meetings of rival political parties and violently attacking anyone who dared to speak out against them. This created a climate of fear, where opposition was not just unpopular, but physically dangerous. Yet, Hitler maintained the facade of legality. He intended to destroy the democratic system not by overthrowing it, but by using its own rules against it. The Nazi Party participated in elections, gradually increasing their share of the vote as the economic crisis deepened. In the 1932 elections, they became the largest party in the German parliament, der Reichstag. They didn't have a majority, but their strength made it impossible for other parties to form a stable government. The political elites, the conservative business leaders, and old guard politicians fatally underestimated Hitler. They saw him as a vulgar but useful tool. They believed they could appoint him as chancellor, control him, and use his popular support to crush the left-wing parties they feared more. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. In January 1933, President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Adolf Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. The Foxes had just handed the keys to the hen house. Within weeks, their plan to control him unraveled. A fire mysteriously broke out in the Reichstag building. The Nazis immediately blamed the communists, manufacturing a crisis and stoking public panic. Hitler convinced President Hindenburg to sign the Reichstag Fire Decree, an emergency order that suspended basic civil liberties, freedom of speech, assembly, and the press in the name of national security. It was meant to be temporary, but it became permanent. This decree gave the Nazis the legal power to arrest their political opponents without trial. Thousands of communists, socialists, and trade unionists were rounded up and thrown into hastily constructed concentration camps. With the opposition eliminated or intimidated, Hitler then pushed the Enabling Act through Parliament. This law effectively transferred all legislative power from the Parliament to Hitler's cabinet for 4 years. It was the death certificate of the Weimar Republic. Democracy in Germany was now officially over. Hitler had achieved a legal dictatorship, not through a violent coup, but by manipulating the law and exploiting the fears of the people and the hubris of his political rivals. With absolute power secured, the true nature of the Nazi regime was unleashed. Germany was transformed into a totalitarian state. The principle of Glacial-Tungor coordination was implemented. All aspects of life, from the legal system and civil service to education and youth groups, were brought under Nazi control. Independent organizations were banned or absorbed. Children were indoctrinated from a young age in the Hitler Youth, taught loyalty not to their parents or to God, but to the Fuhrer. Freedom of thought was extinguished. Books written by Jewish, liberal, or foreign authors were publicly burned in massive bonfires. The press became a mouthpiece for the state, and radio broadcasts carried Goebbels' propaganda into every home. Fear became the primary tool of social control. The Gestapo, the secret state police, encouraged citizens to spy on their neighbors, friends, and even family members. A single critical remark could lead to a midnight knock on the door and disappearance into a concentration camp. This created an atmosphere of pervasive paranoia, atomizing society and making organized resistance nearly impossible. The regime's ideology of racial purity led to horrific persecution. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped German Jews of their citizenship and forbade them from marrying non-Jews. This systematic dehumanization escalated from legal discrimination to public humiliation, expropriation of property, and violent pogroms like Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, in 1938. This was just the beginning of a path that would lead to the ghettos, and ultimately, the industrial-scale murder of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, alongside millions of other Slavs, Roma, disabled individuals, and political dissidents, undesirable by the regime. Unchecked power didn't just corrupt, it metastasized into a machinery of death that consumed Germany and plunged the world into the most destructive war in human history. The world watched Germany's descent with a mixture of disbelief, fear, and in some quarters, even admiration. In the early 1930s, some international observers, including figures in Britain and the United States, were initially impressed by the apparent economic recovery and restoration of order under Hitler. The brutal reality of his regime was either downplayed or ignored. For a nation still reeling from World War I, the primary policy was appeasement. Leaders like British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain believed they could avoid another war by granting Hitler concessions, hoping his ambitions were limited. They allowed him to rearm Germany, remilitarize the Rhineland, and annex Austria and parts of Czechoslovakia, all in violation of international treaties. Each concession only emboldened him further, confirming his belief that the democracies were weak and decadent. In the United States, a strong isolationist sentiment prevailed. Traumatized by the losses of the First World War and preoccupied with the Great Depression, the majority of Americans wanted no part in Europe's conflicts. President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized the growing threat, but he was constrained by public opinion and neutrality acts passed by Congress. It was only after the fall of France in 1940 and, decisively, the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 that the United States fully committed to the fight against the Axis powers. The lesson for modern democracies is stark and enduring. This history shows that constitutional safeguards and democratic institutions are only as strong as the people who defend them. The German experience teaches us that when people are willing to trade liberty for the promise of security, they often end up losing both. It highlights the danger of political polarization, where compromise becomes impossible and extremism finds room to grow. It warns us about the power of misinformation and propaganda to distort reality and demonize minority groups. And it serves as a chilling reminder that charismatic leaders who offer simple solutions to complex problems, who demand absolute loyalty and paint the world in terms of us versus them, pose a fundamental threat to the principles of a free and open society. So why must we keep retelling this story? We remember not to dwell on the darkness, but to recognize the warning signs. The collapse of the Weimar Republic was not an anomaly of history. It was a demonstration of a pattern. It showed how economic hardship can make a society vulnerable to demigods. It revealed how the normalization of political violence erodes the foundations of civil order. It proved that the language of hate, once unleashed, can lead to unimaginable atrocities. Authoritarianism doesn't always arrive with tanks in the streets. Sometimes it arrives with a ballot, a microphone, and a promise to make a nation great again by sacrificing its freedoms. Remembering this history is not about assigning guilt. It is about accepting a shared responsibility to protect our own democratic institutions. It requires us to be critical consumers of information, to reject the politics of fear and division, and to stand up for the rights of all citizens, especially the most vulnerable. The past does not repeat itself exactly, but its echoes are always present. The ultimate lesson from Germany in the 1930s is that democracy is not a destination. It is a constant, fragile, and necessary struggle. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary valuable, please consider subscribing for more deep dives into history's most important lessons.